Good evening. Thank you for coming to the Travelers Rest Chapter's monthly meeting. My name is Richie Doyle. Our board is here, and we had dinner with our speaker at the Lolo Peak Brewery, and it's delightful to see so many of you here. We're delighted to have Sara tonight, Sara Scott, talk about this historic trail. If you are a member of our chapter, thank you. And if you're interested in becoming a member of our chapter, the Travelers Rest chapter of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, you could talk to Jean, our treasurer, at the back table. Also, I'm sure many of you are already members of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and if you're not, you might consider joining. One of the benefits of joining is this quarterly magazine, a very nice magazine about the history of Lewis and Clark Expedition and associated history called We Proceeded On. And if you're interested in that, you can go to lewisandclark.org and find out all you need to know. Next month, I believe we're going to have Bruce Mihelish speak about the horses in the Lewis and Clark Expedition and the history of horses in North America and such. But at this time, I'd like Margaret to come up and tell you about some new developments nearby at a historic site.
Yeah, I'm Margaret Gorski. Many of you know me. I've been with the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation for many years. And I appreciate Richie talking about the fact that Travelers Rest is a chapter of the national organization. The national organization is across the country. They do a lot of lobbying on behalf of the Partnership for the National Trail System to get appropriations from Congress to help the National Park Service administer the National Historic Trail. We give out grants across the country. We usually give out about $50,000 to $60,000 in grants. So if you have a Lewis and Clark project that you want to get some money for, we give a grant out. We give grants out every year. We do scholarships for educational programs. We produce We Proceeded On. So I really can't stress enough how important it is for all the chapter members to also be a member of National. And also, this coming summer, the annual meeting, they're always all kinds of fun. The annual meeting this year is in Astoria, and it begins the 50th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. So the meeting will be in October this year in Astoria, and then the following year will be our grand 50th anniversary of the organization. It'll be in St. Louis, sponsored by the Missouri Historic Society. So that one should be a really exciting, interesting annual meeting. So thank you, Richie, for reminding everybody about National. The other thing I wanted to share with all of you is that, you know, Travelers Rest State Park is what it is because of all the work that both State Parks does and the whole bevy of volunteers through TURFA that helps put on programs and all the activities and helps State Parks take care of the place. Well, I'm proud to announce that we have another Friends group that has been organized for Fort Owen State Park out at Stevensville. Much smaller than Travelers Rest, little acre spot right off the highway between the highway and Stevensville, and it's surrounded by private land. That private land is now owned by a new owner, much more cooperative, and we're looking forward to being able to do some things out there. So I am now the president of the Friends of Fort Owen, and we have the secretary treasurer. Where's Ruth? Ruth in the back there is our secretary treasurer. We'd love to have you join us. And one last plug, on June 23rd is Heritage Days in Stevensville. We are kind of grand opening tours out at the park, and we're going to have some wagon rides starting at the Forest Service office going out to the state park. In order to pull that off, we need some volunteers. So if you want to help us do that this summer, we'd really love to have you join us. So thank you, Richie.
Thank you, Margaret. We're delighted to have Sara Scott here tonight to talk about this historic route. Lewis and Clark When they arrived here in September of 1805, their guide, Toby, told them of this shortcut route up today's Big Blackfoot River. And Harry Fritz says that perhaps was one of the most important pieces of geographical information they received in their entire journey. It had taken them 2.5 months to go from Great Falls to here, Travelers Rest, going a long way, the year of 1805. And it just took Lewis a week the next year to scoot over the Continental Divide. Lewis and Clark named the river after the Indian name. It was the river of the road to the buffalo, the Kokalaharshkit River. And with that, I'd like you to welcome Sara Scott to tell you the rest of this story and associated stories. Please welcome Dr. Sara Scott.
Well, it's a great honor to be here tonight. I have given this talk many times, but I've never given it a stone's throw from Travelers Rest. So this is really a great opportunity for me. Right now, I work for Montana State Parks, and I have done that. Mostly my job involves we have so many historical and archaeological sites, and it's my job to make sure that we take care of those, and if we're going to do something in those parks, that we do it appropriately. But about 1998, I did have the opportunity to work for the Helena National Forest, and there, of course, we went through the bicentennial. Margaret Gorski was a huge player, and so I had an opportunity to be part of the commemoration, and just in talking with Richie tonight about that, he said since that time, a lot of the Lewis and Clark groups have fallen away. But it did leave, the bicentennial left such a great legacy. And I was working for a federal agency, and they really wanted to be inclusive of everybody. So in terms of tribal people, they had a circle of tribal advisors. There were 41 different groups represented. And so our goal was to really look at who used the trail before Lewis and Clark, and obviously honoring Lewis and Clark as well, but also people that came after. So the approach we took was really just a layered landscape approach of looking through time at all the people that used the Lewis and Clark Trail. The area that I'll talk about tonight is the road to the Buffalo, which follows the Blackfoot River from the confluence with the Clark Fork, and then the trail went up and over the Continental Divide. And the area that I studied was a pretty small area just right below the Continental Divide. But in order to get the bigger perspective, which is really the only way that you can evaluate it, you have to look at the bigger part of the trail. So I'll talk about that and then get to the specifics of what we found up Alice Creek. As an archaeologist, before you go out in the field, of course, what you do your literature search. You need to know what archaeological studies have been done along the trail, what was found, who were the Indian people that lived there, the ethnographies that were written about them, historical accounts of early trappers and traders, of course the Lewis and Clark journals, which we had Moulton, which was just awesome because he did such a great job. And then of course there's the ranching, mining, and homesteading history as well. And all those things relate to that trail. And most of you know the Indian use of the trail, of course, was related to buffalo. You had Columbia River Indian tribes coming down the Clark Fork, following the Blackfoot over the Continental Divide to hunt bison. And we know from the archaeological sites along the trail that this has been going on for at least 1,000 years, probably longer than that. And it became part of the ritual of those tribal people is to go over a couple times a year, and that time varied. Sometimes it was 3 times the year, but they would go over, follow the trail, and go out to hunt buffalo. And buffalo was really important, not just as a food source, but clearly, I mean, the buffalo are so giant compared to deer or elk, but also the big thing, and this is very important, is they were a great trading commodity. You could get guns, you could get salmon, you could get shells from the Pacific coast, you could get so many different things if you had the hides and also the horns, the parfleshes, things like that that also came along with them. One of the forms of hunting, which most of you know about the buffalo jumps, we've got 2 parks in our state park system. First Peoples Buffalo Jump up by Great Falls, and then Madison Buffalo Jump, which this drive line here shows a picture of over by Bozeman. And people just, this was such an amazing feat when they went out onto the plains of landscape engineering. So using the landscape, and people must have known it so well to know how to move bison in these certain directions without making them panic. So this is a drive line, and there are thousands of drive lines across Montana. And of course, the drive lines, they'd slowly move the buffalo, and then of course, over the cliff where there were people waiting, if they were injured, they dispatched them. Most of you know before about 1730, 1750, there weren't horses, so people were using dogs. And clearly, when you've got something, a small animal like a dog, the amount of hides and meat that you can bring back with you was so much more reduced than when you had the horse. And the horse, too, I can't stress enough how much the introduction of the horse changed Columbia Plateau and Plains Indian tribes, their behavior in terms of territory, expansion. They could go so many more places than they could before. So it really made a significant difference. And here's, we tend to think of these trails in the woods, going along, or that tribal people were out there bushwhacking through the forest. Well, there were a really well-established network of trails. This is from the Salish and Pend Oreille and Kootenai people, but it wasn't, and in the Lewis and Clark journals, they talk about this too. They always call the paths that they traveled roads because they were really well established. People had been following those same paths for centuries or thousands of years. For the study area that we're looking at, you go down the road to the Buffalo Trail, and as soon as you hit the bottom of the pass, when you're on the east side, it intersects with this trail, which is Richard referred to at dinner tonight, the Old North Trail, which was a trail that extended from Canada to Mexico that was supposedly used for 10,000 years. And interestingly, on this east side of the divide, there's an archaeological site there where they found 10,000-year-old projectile points. It's on private land, sadly, but we do know that and have that information. But you can see the trails go down to the Mussel Shell, they go over to the Yellowstone, up to the Missouri. So there was this established network of trails that people followed. And where a trail started and where it ended, that was really difficult to know because by their nature, one just fades into another. The Buffalo Road Trail, Meriwether Lewis, he translated it. Richie said it differently than I would, Kokalorishkit. And those were, he was translating Nez Perce words, which translate to Buffalo Road or Bison Hunt Trail. And we all know the story, but this is where the base point is of the jumping off for the road to the buffalo. But most of you in here, I'm an archaeologist by trade, most of you know far more about Lewis and Clark than I do. But here we have our staging area, just a stone's throw away. They rest up, they'd had an arduous trip over the Lolo Trail. Clark heads to the Yellowstone. Meriwether Lewis goes up the Blackfoot River. He's got 9 men, 5 Nez Perce guides, and 17 horses. And again, as an archaeologist, some of the things that I was interested in observing are what he talks about, Meriwether Lewis, in terms of Indian customs. about floating, taking as they're crossing the river. They've got their horses, but they have these basins, these deer skin hides, and I've also heard these where they were actually sewn together and blown up, so they floated as a raft. So they talk about that. And their Nez Perce guides tell them that they'll only go as far as the Clark Fork River, because they're going to be cut off by the Mentores or also the Paquis. And those were the Hidatsa, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Otsita, the Assiniboine. There were a lot of enemy tribes out there. Also, they were told by their guides that this was a well-beaten track, references to a road. And they also note as they start traveling that there's a returning party of what they said they called the Mentores, which I think are either the Hidatsa or the Crow. And they also observe buffalo dung, which is also really interesting because a lot of people think the Continental Divide was really the stopping point for buffalo, but clearly they're coming over west of the divide. Meriwether Lewis also noted 5 different abandoned Indian camps that had between 11 and 32 lodges. And so you try and envision that as they're traveling along this trail, and then off to the side are these abandoned structures made of bark and sticks and brush. Just really interesting. I wish there was more of a description of how they looked. This is what's called a wiki-up. And I don't know that they were that formal, but he did observe all those as he was traveling. And on the night of July 6th, before he crossed the Lewis and Clark Pass, they were camped at Beaver Creek, which is just 2 miles west of Lincoln. And there he talked about the buffalo dung, but also the fact that that was the biggest sort of encampment there, which had 32 lodges. So they headed up on July 7th. The Nez Perce guides had told them to take, as they traveled the road, that they would find a fork to the left and to take that left fork, but that if they continued on to the right, that would also lead them back to the Great Falls. And on this day, too, the weather had been pretty good for them, but on July 7th, 1806, things started to change. It was cloudy, it was colder. They moved up Landers Fork, and then over into Alice Creek, and then up and over Lewis and Clark Pass. And I want you to note the trees that were growing up on Lewis and Clark Pass, because it's important a couple slides later. They're pretty gnarly, it's high up, it's windy, it's cold most of the time. So that day when he was on top of Lewis and Clark Pass. Interesting, it has human history of over 1,000 years. Meriwether Lewis traveled this area just a few minutes, but this pass bears his name, and also William Clark, who actually never saw it. But when he got up to the top of Lewis and Clark Pass, he saw Fort Square Butte in the distance, and he knew that was a landmark that he had seen when they were heading toward the Pacific Ocean in 1805. And then after the Lewis and Clark expedition, the trail use, the Buffalo Road continued to be used. In fact, things really started heating up. Because people had the horse, there was so much movement of different people over the pass, and a lot of the Plains Indian tribes came over to the west to raid the Salish groups. That's noted in a lot of historical accounts, that they were just merciless in terms of the raids that they would carry out. In 1842, missionary Nicholas Point, who was the diarist for Father de Smet, he actually traveled over, we think, over the Buffalo Road as well. And then we have the Transcontinental Railroad military exploration. That was in the mid-1850s. We've got a bunch of different people, F.W. Lander, James Doughty, Saxton. There were a lot of people out in this area along the Blackfoot River at that time. And Governor Stevens really favored a transcontinental railroad route over Lewis and Clark Pass. But I guess fortunately, because things are so well preserved, that wasn't selected. and one further to the south was selected. 1865, gold was discovered in Lincoln, and by 1871 there were 3,000 people. So try and envision the native people that had lived in this area doing these regular treks to go to hunt buffalo, and suddenly there's 3,000 people in the corridor of the trail. Just how different that must have been for them. And I think people just adapted, went around the settlements, and continued on. Later, 1850, still have a lot of Indian travel on the trail, and I think as things start to become settled, there's a lot more conflict with the people that, the new homesteaders and ranchers and miners. The Buffalo Road, as Lincoln expands its population, the road that used to carry people going to hunt buffalo starts to carry stagecoaches down the road. And by, let's see, in 1871, General John Gibbon came to the area. He was really interested in what route Meriwether Lewis had taken. He wasn't sure if it was Lewis and Clark Pass or there's another pass that was possible too, Cadott Pass, which is about 4 miles from Lewis and Clark Pass. But using the compass bearings and looking at the journal, he decided, he concluded that it was Lewis and Clark Pass that Meriwether Lewis had traveled over. And by 1882, there's, is Bill Farr here? No. He has written just some great articles about how, the very long and sad history of the demise of buffalo and being able to go out on the plains to hunt. So he's published a couple articles on that with some really good historical accounts of how that all occurred. Ranching and mining started to happen up Alice Creek, and in fact, the Patterson family homesteaded up Alice Creek, and their barn apparently straddled the Buffalo Road heading up to the Continental Divide. And Alberta Patterson, the daughter of John Patterson, had a homestead just right beneath Cadott Pass. And she talks about historically one day being out picking service berries, and suddenly she heard all this noise and commotion, and a whole group of Indian people came with travois and riding fast, right by her as she hid and kind of shirked in the bushes. So now we can kind of drill down a little bit to back to this specific area of Alice Creek, which is the area where we did the field survey work to just try and document the Lewis and Clark Trail on the ground. So as part of that, the main goal is to try and get where the trail is, to figure out where the trail is, and then accurately plot everything that's along it. We had Bob Bergantino, who has spent 30 years plotting the Lewis and Clark Trail, and then he's got USGS quad maps that the Historical Society has, so that was such a great reference and a really good starting point of where potentially the trail would have gone up Alice Creek. And the upshot of all that work, but I'm going to talk about the specific things that were found. This is the map that we were able to develop with all the little squares and circles reflecting features that were found on the ground, and the gray areas are archaeological sites. So here's a picture of the trail tread, which again, when you think about a road, look at this roadbed, and to scale, the two people standing in it. This is where the trail came from, over from Landers Fork into Alice Creek, but you can really see how it was a pretty well-established road. And one of the things, too, that's really characteristic of old trail bed are trees growing in a row. And you can see here, I don't have a pointer, but up where you see the LC16, all this is where it shows where original remnants of the trail were found, but that's where all the trees are growing just all in a row. And here we, in terms of doing the survey, we took Bob Bergantino's notes and then plotted where he thought the trail was on the ground. And then in order to catch all the archaeological sites and features on either side, we looked at a 1/4 mile on this side and a 1/4 mile on that side, and then surveyed the corridor all the way up to the top of the pass. And here's just a shot showing the top of the pass being over here, the prehistoric sites that are there, and these are where you find burned buffalo bone, fire-cracked rock, chipstone tools. Down in here, this is like a very large, right at the base of Lewis and Clark Pass. I think that was a staging area for people coming back from buffalo hunting and then also going out so that you're ready for the journey.
Sarah?
Yes.
I have a request. I'm a 3rd generation Western Montana, but I can't associate everything by the name of these trails. Would you try to associate town names so that we know exactly where you're talking about?
Town names?
Yeah, Lincoln or Missoula or Clinton or wherever.
Let's see. So here's Lincoln. Here's sort of the reference point here. Here's Lincoln, and then Alice Creek is further east of that and north. So that's the area that I'm talking about.
Okay, thank you.
You know, one of the other things that we found along the trail were scarred trees like this. There were 5 different scarred trees that we found. 2 of them were blazes, and Meriwether Lewis did talk about trailblazing when he was in the Bitterroot Mountains here. But these larger scars here are the result of Indian people cutting into the bark, pulling that away. This was usually done in the spring when sap is running at its highest, and then they would consume that. It's really sweet. And so it was really a preferred resource in the spring. And William Clark's Sacagaway in 1805 had told William Clark about, yes, this is something, they saw a scarred tree on the trail, and she said, yes, this is something that our people do. There's scarred trees, probably a lot of you have seen these on the Bitterroot Forest, up in the Flathead, the Lolo. There's a lot of remnants of scarred trees. One of the parks that we manage is Wild Horse Island, which is in Flathead Lake, and there's a grove of scarred trees there. There's 13 of them, and they're just huge, very big around, and some dendrologists did some tree borings into those and found that the oldest one living germinated in 1711, so it's over 300 years old. So later in time, like the BIA stopped people once they were on reservations from doing this, pulling back the cambium layer of the tree because they said it killed trees. But clearly, if we've got these 300-year-old trees, I think people did know what they were doing and left enough so that the tree would survive. And one thing that was pretty prolific along this section of trail, which is about 5 miles that we looked at on Forest Service land, are these rock cairns. And we found 10 of them along the trail. And all these things, even when the trail tread is pretty vague, if you have rock cairns or you have scarred trees and they all seem to kind of go in a line, you have a pretty good indication that you've got the trail there. So we have these rock cairns, and we have, you know, in looking at some of the other studies that people have done, in Wyoming, there's the Bad Pass Trail, where on a 7-mile section of trail, they had 170 rock cairns, and there's a lot of different thoughts about how these rock cairns really function. Are they trail markers? Potentially, as people are moving across the landscape, either with a dog travois or horses, you need to get the rocks that are on the trail out of the way. And so potentially some of these rock cairns could have been used as that. But what this fellow that studied the Bad Pass Trail, Larry Lohendorf, found was that they excavated 16 of these cairns, and inside they found chipstone tools, pottery, bits of buffalo bone, charcoal. So they served more as offering places as people were moving along the trail, which makes a lot of sense to me. And in fact, when Meriwether Lewis and the expedition was coming over from the Bitterroot Mountains, their Nez Perce guides asked for a halt, and when they halted, they built a rock cairn, and they smoked the pipe. So it's a pretty good reference to that these actually had some sort of spiritual value as well as being trail markers. Another interesting feature that we found up on Lewis and Clark Pass, and these are really different, they're stone forts, but where the rock cairns, things were more pulled together. The rocks were in a pile, there were fewer stones, the stones were smaller. These two structures that we found up and above the pass to the west were really different. A couple of archaeologists thought maybe these were vision quest structures where people went out and sought visions and fasted for 4 or 5 days without water or food. But in working with the Salish and Pend Oreille Culture Committee, their place name for Lewis and Clark Pass is Indian Fort Pass, place where warriors sat in small stone structures and watched for Blackfeet raiders. So it was once we kind of heard the oral history information on that, we started thinking, hey, yeah, this is probably what these served as. And looking at stone forts that have been looked at in British Columbia by other archaeologists, what they find is that then in working with local indigenous populations, that the names for the stone forts are to defend from coastal raiders, watch out places for enemies, just the same sort of things. These are defensive structures, and as a fort, forts like we have Fort Benton, Fort Fizzle, Fort Shaw, all these places tend to, you're asserting your right and that the territory there is yours. And it's kind of a form of power and prestige and ownership. So we have these forts which are really interesting up on Lewis and Clark Pass. And again, these stones, and with a lot of the rock cairns, the stones are really deeply embedded in the earth. They're covered with lichen. They look like they've been there for a really long time. And then I started working up in this area of Lewis and Clark Pass in the 1970s. And this stone structure was out on the landscape. And this area, there were sheep herders up there early on in time, in the early 1900s. And some of the local Forest Service people said, oh, that's a stone cross, probably a sheep herder died up there and somebody buried him. But in doing background research on the stone cross, found this reference in Nicholas Point's journal in 1842, where he was taking these major, as I mentioned, Father de Smet and Nicholas Point, they came here to try and convert the Indians to Christianity. And so Nicholas Point, what he would do was go on these hunts where people are walking the trail, crossing the pass, going out on the plains to hunt buffalo. He would accompany the Salish on these journeys. And he talks about reaching the summit of a mountain where he can see a horizon more than 100 leagues, and that's about 300 miles. And then he cites the first Vesper from St. Michael, and that he made and planted a cross, for we were in the middle of Blackfeet country. And the reference of like making and planting a cross, you think of, oh, to me that sounds like somebody's making something out of wood and then sticking it in the ground. But as you recall, Lewis and Clark Pass, the twisted white bark pines that are up there, I can't think of anything less conducive to try and make a cross from. But what's really plentiful up on Lewis and Clark Pass are jillions and jillions of stones. So building materials would have been stone. So, potentially this is a reference from Nicholas Point about making the cross, and also the point of that we were entering into Blackfeet country, just how much tension was a part of this journey for Meriwether Lewis and his men, because they had been told by the Nez Perce they were going to get cut off. And I think in Meriwether Lewis even says, we were on our guard as they traveled the Buffalo Road day and night. So we have all these features on this 5-mile segment of the trail on the Helena Forest, north and east of Lincoln. So we have all these stone features. We've got 10 rock cairns, we have peeled trees, we have the stone cross, we have the forts. One thing that archaeologists are super adamant about, because it's the way that we explain how things changed, is that you need to know when things were built or when people lived in an area. So chronology is absolutely essential. And so after this survey was done, in about 2005, we hired Dan Hall, who was the guy that worked on Travelers Rest here, to prepare a National Register nomination of this segment of the Lewis and Clark Trail. And Dan came up with the great idea, and this is pretty common, people around the world use this, of using lichen and the growth of lichen to investigate the stone features up along Alice Creek. And so what he did was he went to the old Lincoln Cemetery in the town of Lincoln, and he looked for the oldest headstone, and that was Minnie Neal, who died in 1869. And thankfully, Minnie Neal had 2 species of lichen growing on her headstone, so Dan could measure those and then compute what the growth rate for lichen was. And so what he found, he dated 2 different kinds, Rhizocarpum geographicum, which is the most common form that people use because it's a really hardy species of lichen, and then also Lecanora rupicola, which is kind of a long one. But you can see, like in looking at the stone forts and trying to assess their age, the measurements that he got ranged from 1344 to 1655. So these are definitely old, and they are pre-horse. And again, it does kind of validate the Salish oral history. Not that their oral history needs to be validated, but that these were used by Salish people to look for Blackfeet raiders on the other side. And the stone cross, the 5 measurements that they took, that averaged to 1847, and Nicholas Point was through there in 1842. So that's a pretty good match in helping us, another line of evidence, helping us establish what these features, how they can be interpreted and how they function. And just the other rock cairns, you can see that, the dates, the earliest is 1767, and probably the latest is 1941. So again, potentially people traveling the trail and then throwing a rock here or there on top of these cairns as they're moving through. But then also, this was an interesting one as well, this stone hearth. As I mentioned, John Gibbon had come through there trying to do the research on, did Meriwether Lewis use Lewis and Clark Pass? Of course, it wasn't called that then, or over Cadott Pass. And he talks about in his journal, when he was up there in October of 1871, that it was absolutely horrible weather. The wind was blowing, it was just awful, and he was miserably cold. And so he talks about putting together a fire hearth and building a fire on top of the pass. Well, and looking at this stone hearth, which was the only one that we found that looked historic, the measurements in terms of lichen growth look like it kind of supports that potentially that could be related to John Gibbon.
What was feature 3?
Feature 3?
Yeah, so third one down says feature 4 in the left column, and then it says feature 3 if my eyes aren't killing.
This is feature 8?
Just above that.
Feature 4?
Go to the right. Feature 3.
Right.
Right.
Oh, this was like a screw up of the table that I didn't notice. That should have been, pushed down. Sorry, got those mixed up. And, we had about 18 different features, and some of these, when we would go to when Dan visited the rock cairns to do dating, some of these have been pulled apart by modern recreationists, so they weren't suitable. Rocks were turned over or they'd been disturbed. So the reason why we only have this number of things that were looked at is because those were the only ones that were completely undisturbed. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. I didn't catch that. So from all this, the data gathering for the Lewis and Clark Trail, the documentation of where the sites were, where they fell along the trail, we wrote a historic preservation plan that documented where they were, what the management recommendations were. And then also, as I mentioned, we hired Dan Hall to do the National Register nomination for this segment of trail. And now this is a historic district that is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And I will say that's made a really big difference. There have been fires that have been up in that Lincoln area, and the people that are running the management teams look at that and they say, wow, that segment of trail's on the National Register. If we put cat lines along that area, will destroy the features related to the trail. So it's probably better, if we're gonna, try and control the fire, to not control it at all, because we'd cause more damage if we went out there and dug cat lines. So I do want to stress just the importance of the trail to Indian people, and this sure shows in the ethnography that, traveling the trail, that was a big part of people's life. And later in time, it became a way for people to earn status and prestige and wealth, coming back with all those hides and meat. And the landscape was really a dynamic process. All the different generations that traveled those trails, there's a form of landscape learning where, as they're traveling the trail, they're talking about this peak over there, or over at that creek, this thing happened. So it's a really great way to educate kids. And so I think that was a really important thing over time to people. And just travel itself. The Inuit of Alaska, they are also nomadic, just like the Columbia Plateau people. And their word for trail actually translates as home, which I think is pretty profound. They're at home when they're on the trail. And it's really deeply embedded in people's lives. So this is the greatest example, this piece of the Lewis and Clark Trail, of just a cultural landscape where you have all these uses, just like a stratigraphic column. At the bottom, we've got people traveling over to the plains to hunt bison, then we've got exploration for territory and resources, trapping, hunting, trade and warfare, and then finally settlement, ranching, homesteading, mining, coming in the 19th century. And just in conclusion, I think the bicentennial, and Margaret, I thank you so much, because in the Forest Service, she was our leader for the bicentennial. And in talking to Richie tonight, he said that, so like I mentioned, so many of the Lewis and Clark groups have kind of gone by the wayside. But what the Lewis and Clark bicentennial commemoration gave us was really an opportunity to study people that used the trail initially, Lewis and Clark, people later, and then also to document those resources and put them on a map so people can pay attention to where they are and protect them into the future. So, thank you. Yes, and I'm happy to take questions.
Do you have any idea how they would preserve the meat to transport it?
Drying it.
Or how?
Drying it.
Drying it?
Yeah, drying it.
Was the Lewis and Clark expedition ever attacked by natives?
I think that the one incident that did happen was, and again, I'm not a Lewis and Clark expert, but was up on the Marias with Meriwether Lewis. He had some skirmishes with Blackfeet, and 2 Blackfeet were killed. But then they escaped, and on that day rode over 100 miles on horseback, which when you think about that, whoo, yes. Yes?
Those structures up on Lewis and Clark Path that you refer to as forts, is there any indication from the number of rocks there, whether they had, you know, a little fort 5 by 5 by 3 feet tall, or what, how the word fort is very ambiguous to me, and I just wondered if you could throw any light on that.
You know, I don't really know, but that is the term that the Salish used for them, and the size of them, they do look fairly substantial, you know.
You say substantial, 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet?
I think more like 5 feet, 6 feet, but piled up around you so that you were protected and you could look out and be hidden. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'd love to know more about that too, to be able to see what those did actually look like when they were functioning. Yes?
You talked about validating the trail with trees that were lined, but you didn't elaborate what the lined trees, why they were lined.
Oh, that's a good question. You know, that's something that's just really common in abandoned trail bed or abandoned roads, is that trees like Mount Jumbo has, where the old lakeshore lines, you'll see lines of trees. It's, I guess, a better organic quality and mixing so that trees can just grow better along that trail bed, but it's very distinct, and it wasn't anything that had been planted up there by the Forest Service. And it was as you went closer to look at the trees, you could see that it was that depressed road, rutted out area underneath the tree. Yes?
You can see the tree growth in road cuts. Along the highway where they cut into the hill, you can see rows of trees growing.
Mm-hmm. So
They seed themselves.
Mm-hmm. They seed themselves, yeah. There were a couple questions.
Did you ever run into Ted Kaczynski while you were working?
No, I didn't. Yes, but that was something to think about. I will mention, though, as we were working up in this area, the pass has a lot of white bark pine, which is a good food source for grizzly bears, and there were grizzlies in the area where we would find scat, and that was still warm. So it was a little bit daunting working up there. Yes?
We did trap quite a few grizzly bears for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the federal government in that area last year.
Did you?
Yes, yes, one of our more productive areas.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, people have told me, which didn't make surveying in that area any easier, that they had seen some of the bears and that they were as big as a VW bug. And I thought,
We caught all males, by the way, and they are larger than the females. But that was just the luck of the draw, I think. We'll find out more this year.
and in the Alice Creek area specifically?
Yes. Yes. But also Cadott and the other drainages that run parallel with it.
It's not an area where there's many recreationists at all, except that some during hunting season, some in the summer, but people follow hiking trails. They don't go off and bushwhack, so bears kind of have it to themselves.
And some of it's private access. It's controlled, so people have a harder time getting around that. It's a lot of it's hard to get in there.
Yes?
I've always wondered who was, the history of, or the story of the person that Cadott Pass was named after.
Cadott, I believe, which is a good question. You know, I shouldn't say this if I don't know.
Can't hear back here. What was the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Who Cadott Pass was named after? And I think it was an early explorer. Yeah. Yes, way in the back.
The photo that you had of the trail that's been grown over is pretty wide. I was wondering if you have any knowledge. It was just used a lot, or if they used to travel in huge groups that really dug that trail in?
That's another really great question. Actually, later in time, historical records indicate because people moving from the Columbia Plateau over to the plains, there was so much concern about defense, they were traveling in groups of over 1,000 people. And you can imagine the number of horses also that were with them. But again, it wouldn't have been 1,000 people all traveling in a line, but there would have been large numbers of people. And again, we've got archaeological sites along the trail throughout the Blackfoot drainage that document that area was used for at least 1,000 years ago. So think of the, over time and treks, and you're going the same route. You do really wear things down. Yeah. Lauren.
The wonders of the internet cannot pass.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, there's the Fort Archeological, who was the white settler at Fort Benton, and he stood the past
1851. That should be part of the presentation. Let's see.
When they went up to Blackfoot, did they follow the river, or did they go through the Johnswood area that way, or did they follow the current road up through the Potomac?
I think it more, that wasn't my specific study area in terms of actually doing the survey. I just looked below the pass, but I do think they were following the established trail. Yeah, which would have been, when you look at old government land office plat maps, that show the stage road, I think that was the original trail, yeah. Yes?
They comment about the width of the trail. It's a cultural thing for us to stick to the trail, don't get off the trail, don't step on the grass, follow a person in front of you. But there are people who travel in groups who, for lack of a better term, they travel in miles. And no particular structure to the group, so you might have a group that's 15 people wide following a route or a trail.
Yeah, and I think, but you have to remember that for a lot of these treks, they were pulling travois loaded down, and so you're not going to be going cross country with a, and John Ewers, who studied the Blackfeet, found that the really small Indian horses that they were using, they could do about 300 pounds. So think of, a horse with 300 pounds kind of wandering off with a travois trailing, it's a recipe for disaster. Yes, Scott.
The gentleman next to me here, Dean, was theorizing that you'd have trees in a line when you have that much horse poop in a trail. And maybe that was pretty good fertilizer. Also, I've read
good point.
From a French person's perspective, and I think they said cadeau.
Which would, yeah. You wouldn't pronounce the T. Yes?
Does anybody know, with the groups that were going from the Columbia Plateau over to Hunter Bison, did the entire people group go, or did only half the population go, or?
The accounts vary in terms of what you hear. Some of it's families going over there, but I think later in time, it was just really dangerous. So I do think it tended to be more younger, probably men, doing the trek. But there are also references of people staying behind, and that the people that did travel the road to the buffalo had more prestige and status than those who stayed behind. Yes?
Is there evidence of the Clovis culture being here in Montana?
Yes, there is, and that would be near Wilsall, the Anzac site. Yeah, but not in this area that I know of. Yeah, which isn't to say that at some point somebody might find something, but.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Scott.
Oh, thank you.
I failed to mention on introducing you that you're an archaeologist with Montana State Parks, just in case anyone wasn't aware of that. And travels quite extensively, and probably could write a book or two.
Well, I was hoping people would read the slide, so it did say Montana State Parks. Yeah, I do work for them now, yeah.
Thank you for your questions and for coming, and I
Yeah,
hope to
thank
see
you.
you next month.